Our first reading is a reading from the Acts of the Apostles. Then Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice, and proclaimed, "You who are Jews, indeed all of you staying in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and listen to my words. You who are Israelites, hear these words. Jesus the Nazarene was a man commended to you by God, with mighty deeds, wonders, and signs, which God worked through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This man, delivered up by the set plan and foreknowledge of God, was killed using soldiers to crucify him. But God raised him up, releasing him from the throes of death, because it was impossible for him to be held by it. For David says of him, 'I saw the Lord ever before me. With him at my right hand I shall not be disturbed. Therefore my heart has been glad and my tongue has exulted. My flesh too will dwell in hope, because you will not abandon my soul to the netherworld, nor will you suffer your Holy One to see corruption. You have made known to me the paths of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence.' My brothers, one can confidently say to you about the patriarch David that he died and was buried, and his tomb is in our midst to this day. But since he was a prophet and knew that God had sworn an oath to him that he would set one of his descendants upon his throne, he foresaw and spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that neither was he abandoned to the netherworld, nor did his flesh see corruption. God raised this Jesus. Of this we are all witnesses. Exalted at the right hand of God, Jesus received the promise of the Holy Spirit from our God, and what you now hear and see is the outpouring of that promise. The word of God. Our psalm response is, "Lord, you will show us the path of life." Lord, you will show us the path of life. Keep me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to God, "My Lord are you." O Lord, my allotted portion and my cup, you it is who hold fast my lot. Lord, you will show us the path of life. I bless the Lord who counsels me. Even in the night, my heart exhorts me. I set the Lord ever before me. With God at my right hand, I shall not be disturbed. Lord, you will show us the path of life. Therefore, my heart is glad and my soul rejoices. My body too abides in confidence, because you will not abandon my soul to the netherworld, nor will you suffer your faithful one to undergo corruption. Lord, you will show us the path of life. You will show me the path to life, abounding joy in your presence, the delights at your right hand forever. Lord, you will show us the path of life.
Second reading, a reading from the first letter of Peter. Chapter 1:17, verses 17 to 21. Beloved, when you pray, call intimately on our God, who judges everyone impartially on the basis of their actions. Conduct yourselves with reverence during the time of your sojourning, realizing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your ancestors, not with perishable things like silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like a spotless, unblemished lamb. He was known before the foundation of the world, but revealed in the final time for you, who through him believe in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. The word of God.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Glory to you, Lord. That very day, the first day of the week, Two of Jesus' disciples were going to a village 7 miles from Jerusalem called Emmaus, and they were conversing about all the things that had occurred. And it happened that while they were conversing and debating, Jesus himself drew near and walked with them, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. And he asked them, "What are you discussing as you walk along?" They stopped, looking downcast, and one of them, named Cleopas, said to him in reply, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know of the things that have taken place there in these days?" And he replied to them, "What sort of things?" They said to him, "The things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet mighty in deed and word, before God and all the people, how our chief priests and rulers both handed him over to a sentence of death and crucified him. But we were hoping that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since this took place. Some women from our group, however, have astounded us. They were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They came back and reported that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who announced that he was alive. Then some of those with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women had described, but him they did not see." And he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are! How slow of heart to believe all the prophets spoke. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them what referred to him in all the scriptures. As they approached the village to which they were going, he gave the impression that he was going on farther. But they urged him, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them, and it happened that, while he was with them at table, he took bread, he said the blessing, broke it, and gave it to them. And with that, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, but he vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the way and opened the scriptures to us?" So they set out at once and returned to Jerusalem, where they found gathered together the 11 and those with them who were saying, "The Lord has truly been raised and has appeared to Simon." Then the two recounted what had taken place on the way and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The gospel of the Lord. He took bread, said the blessing, broke it, and gave it to them. And with that, their eyes were opened and they recognized him. When I studied sacramental theology at St. Bernard's here in Rochester, my professor, Dr. David Stoser, asked the class to read an article written by Enrique Dussel, an Argentine-Mexican theologian and philosopher, whose work centers on liberation, ethics, and global politics. The article is entitled, "The Bread of the Eucharistic Celebration as a Sign of Justice in the Community." And its main thesis is this: bread is life to the destitute, and it is murder to deprive them of it. Dussel and Professor Stoser taught me that the words, "I was hungry and you did not feed me," not only have sacramental meaning, but economic meaning. To offer a sacrifice from the possessions of the poor is like killing a child before their mother's eyes. Put another way, justice is the practical condition that makes possible the Eucharistic celebration, which saves. I'll try and help you understand what all of this means with a story. Some years ago, as I walked into a salon, I had not anticipated that the visit would take on much significance and symbolic meaning. It had been many months since my last visit, but my stylist had taken an extended maternity leave after giving birth to her second child. And she'd been gone for so long that together we joked about whether she'd actually given birth to an infant or to a small adult. And as she gently held my head while stroking my hair and laying me back in the basin of running water, she calmly said to me, "Elijah was killed." Well, actually, he was murdered. I jumped up from my reclined position and tightly wrapped my arms around her, and we stood for a long while that way in the blood of Christ. And in that embrace, Monique and I came to a shared understanding about just what it is that murder and deprivation really mean. Settled back into the ritual of washing, Monique poured water over my head as she worked the lather into a comforting rhythm. She told me about the death of her love and helpmate, Elijah. She said that the sight and sound of the blood rushing from his wound was like milk poured out by the gallon. Now, she told me, she understood in real terms the magnitude of the moment that I had related to her during an earlier visit, the moment when I found myself staring down at a pool of blood with mop in hand in, of all places, the living room where my Uncle DJ had been left for dead. He was awakened in the wee hours of the morning by an intruder who broke into his home in the city of Rochester and fired a gun. And as I stood there staring at the blood on the floor, it was revealed to me that it was not simply the intruder's bullet, but rather his deprivation-induced depravity that took my uncle's life. And so, Monique too found herself facing deprivation, economic deprivation. Though she wasn't married to Elijah, his death, in effect, had left her widowed. With newborn and one-year-old daughters to feed, she returned to work in the salon 1 month after the murder of her partner. She and her daughters became the face of the poor, and like many working poor, Monique hoped that despite the structural injustices that enable the rich to appropriate to themselves the hard labor of the poor, that she and her children would not be separated from the product of her labor, bread. It is life to the destitute, and it is indeed murder to deprive them of it. Where there is no wonder at creation, known as human life, that is violently laid to waste, there is no wonder at creation, known as nature, for it too is spent without thought and laid to waste. Murder here in the city of Rochester and in cities all across this country is the ugly manifestation of environmental racism that those who shield themselves in a cocoon of privilege do not wish to acknowledge or confront. It is not a crisis separate from the environmental movement in which people of faith who purport to be genuinely concerned can simply opt out of, exclude themselves from, or turn their faces away. The injustice of environmental racism, social, economic, and political divestiture deprives already distressed urban communities of the basics to survive and flourish. And too often, investments that could be used to help create healthy environments and give life are instead steered by their privilege into projects that memorialize their benevolence and achievement. Consequently, each such act of institutionalized deprivation perpetrated against those whom the dominant culture has discarded, destroys lives, some through the slow, painful progression of suffering from want, and others with a bullet in the blink of an eye. So environmental theories and practices that, one, failed to understand that human ecology conditions and is conditioned by natural ecology. Two, make no expression of moral outrage at the epidemic of violence in inner cities. And three, resist confronting the institutionalized socioeconomic and political structures that bind historically oppressed peoples to distressed environments, thereby giving rise to a culture of violence. These omissions are symptomatic of privilege that renders injustice invisible. Carl Anthony, an ecologist and professor of biology, brought this point home when he stated, "Without justice in cities, there will be no solution to the problems of wilderness and open space, endangered species, and natural beauty that the privileged are wont to claim for God, for country, and the future benefit of their heirs." The act of conservation, or rather claiming open space and natural beauty, quote, "for my grandchildren," unquote, is an act that in and of itself further disadvantages already historically disadvantaged children consigned to distressed environments, and in some instances disadvantages them literally to death. The choice to act on behalf of the child who is a beneficiary of white privilege over and against the child who is disenfranchised or disadvantaged by it is not environmentalism, but the very definition of environmental racism. Where the bread of life is not shared, it is the bread of death, and the one who eats it eats damnation to himself. So what then is a community of faith to do about climate change and environmental degradation? In today's readings from the book of Acts and the Gospel according to Luke, Jesus is presented to the faithful as a prophet, unjustly executed by the lawless, but released from the throes of death and exalted at the right hand of God. Understand that the role of the prophet is to act as an intermediary between God and Israel, to hold the faithful to God's standards of righteousness, of compassion, of equality, of justice, and to call the people to worship the one true God, and to threaten judgment for transgression. And so it is the prophet Jesus who, beginning with the book of Genesis, reveals himself in and through Israel's long prophetic history to open the eyes of the two disciples traveling along the road to Emmaus. Now, if you accepted Mother Earth's Lenten invitation to read the encyclical Laudato Si, written by Pope Francis, who was another Argentinian, you might recall reading that he also points to the book of Genesis that makes explicit the fact that human life is grounded in not two, but three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. And as the prophets through the ages, from Moses to Jesus, have time and again proclaimed, these three vital relationships have been broken, both outwardly and within us. This rupture, Pope Francis writes, is sin. The harmony between Creator, humanity, and creation as a whole was disrupted by our presuming to take the place of God and refusing to acknowledge our creaturely limitations. This in turn distorted our mandate to have dominion over the earth, to till it and keep it. And so from Moses and all the prophets to the revelation of Jesus the Nazarene, the prophetic critique of these three vital relationships was and is a voice for life in a world bent on death. It is a critique that decries the accumulation of land by the wealthy for Airbnbs in the face of epidemic homelessness, the extraction of economic surplus through taxation of the poor to the benefit of the rich, the acquisitive lifestyle of the moneyed elite, increased deprivation and hunger in urban centers, debt slavery, unfair trade and commerce, and the questionable ethics of our judicial system. In response to the prophetic voice and to the breaking of the bread, heavily freighted with symbolic meaning, the task of the community of faith is prophetic action, to open our eyes and to begin to do the hard work of restoring right relationship with God, with neighbor, and with the earth itself. And so I'm very honored and so pleased to be able to share with you today that Spiritus Christi is undertaking a very special project of prophetic action to do our part as a community of faith to help restore harmony between God, neighbor, and the earth. Last month, Spiritus, through the efforts of the Mother Earth Committee, in collaboration with the Prison Outreach Ministry and Nielsen House, was awarded a grant administered through a partnership between the Monroe County Soil and Water Conservation District and Cornell Cooperative Extension. The grant is providing enough resources to help Nielsen House finally realize its dream of planting a community garden in its backyard. With 5 raised garden beds and 1 bed of pollinators, flowers, and all seedlings courtesy of Equicenter's 3-acre organic farm, the garden is expected to yield 150 to 300 pounds of produce in its first season alone. And that will provide food for Nielsen House, for Jennifer House, for Grace of God, as well as Prison Outreach Ministry graduates and their children residing in apartments within the city of Rochester. The grant will also provide urban gardening workshops and offer residents the opportunity to develop a mutually beneficial relationship with soil, water, flora, and fauna that they might not have previously had. It is an opportunity to develop ecological sensitivity that obliges people to care for and make use of the earth's bounty responsibly, and to recognize its value not simply for its utility to humanity and to our heirs, but more importantly, because of its mere existence. The earth, with all that is within it, blesses and gives God the Creator glory. Now I'm going to bring this home with one more story that I'm going to share with you. It's about the musician and activist Erykah Badu, who has been described by some as the incarnation of Billie Holiday. And some of you might recall that she recently headlined the Rochester International Jazz Fest at the Eastman Theater here in Rochester. Miss Badu was being interviewed by MSNBC reporter Ari Melber, who asked her to share her thoughts about Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' remark, "We will never ever surrender to the woke mob. Florida is where woke goes to die." You see, Miss Badu popularized the word woke with her 2008 song, Master Teacher, wherein she makes prophetic observations about the signs of the times. The chorus of the song is, "I stay woke." And in response to the governor's remarks, Miss Badu says she believes that woke has become just another way to say black or thug. And then she further says, but I can tell you what woke means. It just means aware, being in alignment with nature. Because if you're in alignment with that, you're aware of everything that's going on. And so it happened that while he was with them at table, he took bread, said the blessing, broke it, and gave it to them. And with that, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. Stay woke, Spiritus.